June 24, 1944, Cotentin Peninsula north of Cherbourg. The morning air was cold and salt-sour from the channel, a pale light filtering through low cloud that pressed down on the hedgerows like a lid. German sentries in Riggelbau bunkers rubbed grit from their eyes and tasted damp concrete. Telephone lines hummed faintly in the walls. Somewhere beyond the wire, a single lark went up. The first sign was not the flash, but a sound that did not belong to the coast, a long ripping crack from the sky's underside, like canvas torn by a gale. Men looked up, though they could see nothing. Then the earth flexed. A shell the size of a beer barrel struck a ridge behind Fort du Roule, and the hill answered with a flat, heaving roar that knocked helmets against bulkheads and drove powdered cement in choking curtains from the ceiling seams. A corporal in the bocage later wrote that the ground seemed to buckle under his ribs, that fear arrived before the dust settled, and that no rifle bullet had ever put that taste of metal in his mouth. The Atlantic Wall had taught these garrisons to measure dangers by caliber. They knew the light 105s by their rapid patter, and the lean, destructive 155s by their longer, hammering lift. What came now was neither. The Americans had inched into position in the night, surveyors whispering over aiming circles, prime movers easing monstrous barrels behind hedges, gun crews laying steel plates on spaded ground. When they began to fire, it was with the deep, deliberate cadence of a machine that did not hurry. The 240mm howitzer, M1, very heavy artillery, sent a 360-pound high-explosive shell on a high arc out to more than 25,000 yards, and even fired at a careful pace, about a round every couple of minutes. The weight of its arrival was measured not in bursts, but in small earthquakes. A very heavy battalion, 4 guns strong under VII Corps, shifted its sheaf across command posts, strong points, and concrete casemates that had outlasted storms and smaller guns. Wire obstacles tore like wet brush. A dugout mouth sealed itself, as if a hand had crushed it shut. Inside the bunkers, the lights blinked and died. Dust filled mouths and ears. The smell became electrical and sharp, the breath of broken insulation and raw earth. Runners slid on loose gravel in communication trenches. A captain found his field telephone stone silent and felt the wall behind it thrumming, an animal pinned. Men who had boasted that concrete was a second skin learned the difference between splinters and fragments. The former merely stung. The latter arrived as fist-sized shards that skated down steel stairwells and rang like cymbals. Above, observers in American OPs adjusted by map and flash, heavy sets relaying corrections to fire direction centers that spoke in numbers, not anger. Where the sheaf tightened, entire embrasures disappeared behind avalanches of their own revetment. Survivors who crawled blinking into the open saw the geometry of their defense distorted, angles splayed, parapets folded, the neat grid of trenches slumped as if thawed. More dangerous was what they no longer saw, the certainty that reinforced shelter would absorb punishment until help arrived. A sergeant with a field grey sleeve caked white at the elbow wrote months later that the first round convinced him the wall could be broken from behind without a single infantryman in sight. By noon the firing shifted, walking inland to silence guns that had harassed the beaches days before. By evening the rumour had a number, 240, and a shape. The slow-breathing monster that fired it, few in number, fewer than 400 made by war's end, but enough to make any bunker feel thin. The tremor that morning was more than concussion. It was a message from a weapon conceived for sieges, built in American foundries, when experience in North Africa proved that some positions could not be rushed, only reduced. To understand how that monster was forged, why such weight of metal was demanded, how it was shipped across the Atlantic, and what design choices let it pry open fortresses, we must step back from the shaking bunkers to the drawing boards and factories that brought the 240mm to Europe. The story of the 240mm howitzer does not begin with the thunder of its shells over Normandy, but in the uneasy quiet between 2 world wars. In the 1920s and 1930s, as the United States Army studied the battles of Verdun, the Somme and the Hindenburg Line, one lesson stood carved into the scarred earth of Europe. Heavy artillery had decided the pace of war. The French 400mm railway guns and the German 420mm Big Berthas had reduced fortresses that once seemed eternal. Yet, as budgets shrank in the lean years and doctrine shifted toward mobility, the American army allowed its heaviest siege guns to vanish into storage and obsolescence. By the late 1930s, as Europe armed itself once more, the US possessed excellent medium artillery, the 105mm M2 howitzer and the 155mm long tom, but no modern counterpart to the massive siege pieces that could crush concrete with single blows. The gap became painfully obvious once the United States entered combat in North Africa in late 1942. At Tunisia, German and Italian defenders clung to mountain redoubts, reinforced by concrete bunkers and natural caves that shrugged off field guns. The lighter howitzers could shatter infantry attacks, but against walls 2 meters thick or positions dug into rock, their shells expended themselves in sparks and dust. Commanders realized that while maneuver could seize open terrain, victory in Europe would eventually demand the reduction of prepared defenses, fortress cities, underground batteries, and ultimately, the Siegfried Line. The army had mobility. What it lacked was a hammer heavy enough to split stone. The responsibility fell to the Watervliet arsenal in New York, the historic foundry that had produced American cannons since the 19th century. In 1940, under the shadow of the fall of France, its engineers began drafting the largest field artillery piece the US would ever standardize, the 200mm howitzer. M1, it was not a weapon for mobile warfare, but for siege and methodical destruction. Each barrel, over 20 feet long, fired a shell weighing 360 pounds. At maximum charge, its range stretched to nearly 25,000 yards, 15 miles, far enough to reach into the rear echelons of an enemy defensive zone. Its mission was clear: reduce hardened targets that no lighter gun could touch. This was not an indulgence, but a response to a hardening battlefield. Across occupied Europe, German engineers poured millions of cubic yards of reinforced concrete into the Atlantic Wall, transforming the coastline into a belt of casemates, command posts, and armored batteries. The Siegfried Line along Germany's western border was laced with pillboxes and anti-tank obstacles built to resist anything short of siege artillery. Even in Italy, the Gustav Line demonstrated how mountains fortified with bunkers could bleed Allied divisions white unless pulverized at their roots. Axis doctrine relied on static, layered defense. The Allied answer was firepower, on a scale that erased the illusion of permanence. Standardized in 1943, the 240mm howitzer was produced in limited numbers, only around 315 by war's end, but each was treated as a strategic asset. The guns were issued to very heavy artillery battalions, 4 weapons apiece, supported by immense tractors and cranes. Their sheer size meant they could not be rushed forward in pursuit, but once positioned, they reached deeper and struck harder than anything else in the American arsenal short of naval guns. Army ground forces doctrine made their role explicit: counter-battery fire against enemy long-range artillery, destruction of key command centers, and the deliberate smashing of fortified zones that blocked advances. The decision to build such weapons mirrored the broader evolution of Allied strategy. In 1942, American planners had dreamed of fast armored thrusts that would collapse the enemy. By 1943, experience in North Africa and Sicily had taught a harsher truth. Progress against entrenched Axis troops was measured in yards, not miles. To defeat Nazi Germany required smashing its fortifications stone by stone until no bunker or fortress could shelter resistance. The 240mm howitzer was not designed for glory in a charge, but for the grim, necessary work of eroding the enemy's will and material advantage until cracks appeared in every line. By late 1943, the first battalions of these weapons were trained and firing practice rounds on American proving grounds. The crews learned to handle shells with cranes, to balance barrels weighing over 20 tons, and to disassemble and reassemble the weapon for transport on specialized trailers. Soldiers joked that it was less a gun than a small factory on wheels, yet behind the humor was recognition. This was the tool that would open the gateways to fortress Europe. Thus, the weapon's origin is inseparable from the war's trajectory. Forged in necessity, born from the recognition that mobility alone could not shatter concrete, the 240mm howitzer embodied the industrial answer to an industrial problem. It was the material expression of a strategy that saw firepower as the precondition of maneuver. From this crucible of design and doctrine, the monster of Normandy emerged, its story now turning from conception to the practical marvel of how such a colossal weapon was constructed, transported across oceans, and brought into the field of. In the summer of 1943, American proving grounds at Aberdeen and Fort Bragg unveiled a weapon that seemed, at first glance, more at home on a railway siding than a battlefield. The 240mm howitzer M1 was enormous. Its barrel alone weighed nearly 20 tons, and the entire piece, when assembled, stretched more than 35 feet from spade to muzzle. Standing on its 8-wheeled transport carriage, it dwarfed the men who served it. To soldiers accustomed to the sleek silhouette of the 105mm howitzer, or the long, lean frame of the 155mm long tom, the new weapon looked less like a gun than an industrial machine. A corporal present at one early demonstration recalled that when it fired, the shockwave punched through the chest like a hammer, and even veterans of the artillery branch blinked at the raw violence it unleashed. At its core, the weapon was designed for one task: to obliterate defenses that other artillery could only mark with scars. Its 360-pound high-explosive shell, encased in thick steel and packed with amatol or TNT, could be fired more than 25,000 yards, over 14 miles, at maximum range. When the shell landed, its effect was not measured in fragments but in displacement. Concrete walls collapsed, entire embrasures caved inward, and wire entanglements were shredded as if scythed. Reports from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers later noted that a single direct hit could compromise a pillbox with walls 6 feet thick, and repeated hits made rubble of what had been designed to last decades. The technical sophistication behind this brute force was equally impressive. The howitzer employed a hydro-pneumatic recoil system that bled off the monstrous energy of each firing stroke, allowing the barrel to return smoothly to battery rather than shattering its own carriage. The steel split-trail design gave both stability and traverse, enabling a skilled crew to shift aim across a wide arc without repositioning the entire weapon. Elevation ranged up to 65 degrees, which meant that 240mm could lob shells in high parabolic arcs over ridges or into valleys where defenders believed themselves safe. Firing tables provided by the Army Ballistic Research Laboratory translated elevation and charge increments into precise distances, allowing American batteries to strike targets they could not see with mathematical reliability. Yet the gun's immense power came at a price. To emplace a single 240mm howitzer required heavy prime movers such as the M6 high-speed tractor or the M33 prime mover, each dragging specialized transport wagons, the barrel on one, the carriage on another. Fair crane was necessary to lift and seat the barrel during assembly, and crews labored for hours to secure the gun on its firing platform, spade the trails, and align it on target. A full battery of 4 pieces required not only gunners, but engineers, mechanics, and dedicated ammunition trains. Each shell demanded careful handling with hoists and loading trays, and at nearly 200 kilograms apiece, even the strongest men could not hope to move them without mechanical aid. Once ready, however, the weapon justified its enormous logistical footprint. Its rate of fire, roughly 1 round every 4 to 5 minutes, was slow by field artillery standards, but in practice each shell represented the destructive weight of dozens of lighter rounds. A technical report in late 1943 observed that a single battery could reduce a hardened defensive complex to rubble in under an hour. American commanders took the point further. Why spend days pounding a fortress with lighter guns, at great risk to infantry, when a handful of 240mm shells could achieve the same in minutes? In comparison to its contemporaries, the American giant stood apart. The German 21cm Mörser, 18 howitzer, fired a 250-pound shell to about 10 miles. The Soviet B-4 203mm gun howitzer could manage slightly more, but at a slower rate and with a lighter projectile. Neither matched the combination of range, explosive yield, and accuracy offered by the M1. Allied intelligence officers noted with satisfaction that the 214mm effectively outgunned the fortress makers. Against such a weapon, thick concrete was not assurance but a liability, for defenders could be buried alive in the very positions meant to save them. For the crews who served it, The monster became both a source of pride and frustration. Pride because they knew their work shifted the balance of battles. Frustration because moving the gun across Europe was a campaign in itself. Convoys clogged with ammunition wagons, fuel trucks, and cranes followed the batteries like shadows. Yet the very difficulty underscored the weapon's importance. American generals would not commit such resources unless the returns were decisive, and for the infantry who advanced through shattered bunkers and silenced batteries, the results spoke for themselves. By the end of 1943, with training complete and the weapon declared fully operational, the 240mm howitzer was ready to sail for Europe. For German defenders, its technical existence was still only rumor. But soon enough, they would come to know its thunder personally. The blueprint had become steel, the prototype had become a battalion asset, and the stage was set for its first devastating appearance in combat. January 1944. Italy was locked in winter, its mountains armored in mist and snow. The Allied advance up the peninsula had slowed to a crawl, caught on the teeth of the Gustav Line. At its heart stood Monte Cassino, a steep bastion crowned by the ancient Benedictine Abbey and flanked by ridges honeycombed with bunkers, tunnels, and dugouts. German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, men regarded as some of the toughest in Hitler's army, dug in with confidence. They had already endured weeks of Allied bombing and relentless shelling from 105s and 155s, and still the line held. Concrete bunkers shook but remained intact. The abbey's ruins became firing nests. To them, artillery was a known menace, survivable with grit and stone. Then, in January, a new sound rolled across the Liry Valley. It began with a tearing crack in the sky, followed by a concussion that struck as though the earth itself had revolted. The first 240mm shells slammed into the Cassino slopes, with a violence that even veterans had not imagined. Where lighter calibers chipped and splintered, these detonations resculpted the mountainside. Entire positions vanished, swallowed in clouds of stone dust and avalanches triggered by the blast. A German survivor later recalled that the walls we had trusted folded like cards, and the ceiling came down before a man could draw breath. In some bunkers, men were crushed instantly. In others, the air pressure alone knocked soldiers unconscious as tons of debris collapsed into confined chambers. For the Allies watching from the valleys below, the effect was equally startling. Aerial bombing runs had scarred Cassino without silencing it. Lighter artillery had consumed millions of shells with little to show. But the 240mm howitzers, in batteries of 4, achieved in minutes what weeks of bombardment had failed to accomplish. A direct hit reduced command posts into tombs, and observation bunkers perched high on the slopes were blasted apart, their steel cupolas hurled downslope in fragments. The psychological impact spread faster than the rubble. For the first time, German paratroopers realized that no depth of concrete could guarantee survival. Allied infantry advancing after such fire missions discovered defenses twisted and broken. Entrances to dugouts were sealed by rock slides, machine gun nests had collapsed inward, and barbed wire entanglements had been pulverized into mangled heaps. One American officer wrote that where once the German defenses had been orderly, geometrical, and precise, they now resembled a landscape clawed open by giants. The howitzer did not merely neutralize targets. It unstitched the logic of the defensive system itself. For the gunners serving the 240s, Cassino was a proving ground. Crews labored through rain and mud to move their immense weapons into position, assembling them under camouflage nets while Luftwaffe reconnaissance circled overhead. Every round demanded cranes and loaders. Every fire mission meant calculations against steep gradients and treacherous weather. Yet the results justified the ordeal. Reports from 5th Army's Artillery Command noted with satisfaction that counter-battery fire had been suppressed more effectively than in any prior engagement. Enemy guns silenced by the 240s did not return to life. German intelligence quickly marked the new weapon as a grave threat. Field reports from Cassino warned higher command of extremely heavy caliber fire, describing craters 6 meters across and bunkers collapsed beyond recovery. Requests for reinforcement spoke less of morale than of survival. Paratroopers could not endure in positions that disintegrated around them. From that moment onward, German orders specifically cautioned against underestimating American artillery, citing the presence of the 240 mm as decisive. By spring, as the battle dragged on and the abbey itself was reduced to a shattered shell, the thunder of the howitzer became part of Cassino's rhythm, methodical, remorseless, each impact cracking stone and will alike. What air power had failed to eliminate, the monster gun reduced systematically. Its baptism of fire had proven the concept beyond doubt. The weapon was not an experimental extravagance, but a battlefield necessity. From Italy's mountains, its reputation spread ahead of it, carried in whispers among German troops, who now spoke of an American gun that could bring down the strongest shelter. From the shattered slopes of Monte Cassino, the story turns naturally to the German reaction, their fear, their study of the weapon, and their grim realization that a new era of Allied firepower had arrived. By the winter of 1944, the weapon's existence was no longer a rumor. German intelligence officers, compiling daily reports from the Italian front, spoke in stark, almost reluctant terms of an American gun unlike anything they had anticipated. At first, the reports were dismissed as exaggerations born of battlefield panic, claims of shells that swallowed tanks, or of bunkers collapsing without direct hits. But as evidence accumulated, the 10th Army headquarters in Italy began circulating memoranda, describing a very heavy field howitzer of unusual caliber, estimated at 24 cm. The language betrayed surprise. The Americans, who had long been seen as masters of mobility and mechanization rather than siege warfare, had apparently adapted a railway-sized weapon into field service. Interrogations of captured artillerymen and infantry confirmed the suspicion. Prisoners spoke of battalions organized around 4 massive pieces, each requiring cranes and prime movers to emplace, but capable of outranging and outblasting anything the Germans had in their immediate arsenal. Shell fragments recovered from craters at Cassino were measured at thicknesses far beyond the familiar 155 mm caliber, their twisted steel edges proof of charges that had detonated with unusual violence. Engineers noted that the craters reached 10 to 12 meters across, and in some soft soils, nearly as deep as a man's height. Large enough to conceal a Panzer IV, one report remarked. Inside the bunkers, the experience translated into dread that official memoranda could not quite capture. Paratroopers whispered of Erdbebengeschosse, earthquake shells, that seemed to make the ground itself ripple. Survivors described pressure waves that burst lamps, blew open steel doors, and left men bleeding from nose and ears even when walls still stood. Officers attempted to restore composure by pointing out the slow rate of fire, barely 1 round every few minutes, and urged their men to endure the intervals. Yet such logic did little to blunt the fact that even a single shell, landing true, could entomb an entire command section or cave in the heart of a reinforced strongpoint. By mid-1944, as reports filtered northward from Italy to France, German artillery officers began to treat the 240 meters with the same grim respect once reserved for Allied bombers. Intelligence bulletins issued to units along the Normandy front noted that very heavy American howitzers had been sighted disembarking at French ports. They warned that coastal batteries, already under naval threat, might soon be subjected to bombardment from land-based guns of extraordinary power. Commanders were advised to reinforce dugouts with extra depth and to rotate staff frequently to minimize casualties from a single catastrophic strike. Still, the subtext was clear. The safe refuge of a bunker was no longer certain. The psychological effect was as corrosive as the physical. German defensive doctrine had long rested on the premise that concrete, earth and steel could buy time against numerically superior foes. A platoon in a well-sighted casemate was expected to hold off entire battalions until counterattacks arrived. But as word of the monster howitzer spread, faith in fortifications weakened. Men spoke openly of positions that could not be held once the Americans brought their new siege artillery into play. The concept of an impregnable bunker, cornerstone of the Atlantic Wall and Siegfried Line alike, began to erode at precisely the moment when Allied material superiority was already overwhelming German morale. For higher command, the problem was not merely tactical but doctrinal. If the Americans had indeed fielded a railway-class weapon with battlefield mobility, then the old calculus of static defense had to be reconsidered. Some staff officers argued that the 240mm was too rare, too logistically burdensome to be decisive. Others warned that even in small numbers, its psychological effect could unhinge local resistance, especially among second-line units and foreign conscripts manning the fortresses. The debate echoed through headquarters, but in the trenches and tunnels the verdict had already been delivered. When the earthquake shells came, no man felt safe. This convergence of analysis and fear framed the German reaction. They now knew their enemy had invested immense industrial effort into producing and shipping such titans, and that effort would not have been made unless the Allies intended to use them systematically. The next question for both sides was how. How could the Americans overcome the vast logistical demands of transporting, assembling, and supplying such behemoths in the heart of a fast-moving war? From the German perspective, that question defined their dread. For the Americans, it became the challenge of turning an engineering marvel into a battlefield instrument of relentless destruction. The 240mm howitzer was not only a weapon of steel and fire, it was a testament to the industrial might that Franklin Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. Without America's factories, railroads, and manpower, the gun would have remained a prototype, an experiment too unwieldy for war. Instead, by 1945, more than 300 of these giants stood in service, each the product of a supply chain so vast and coordinated that it dwarfed anything Germany could attempt under the strains of blockade and strategic bombing. The heart of production lay in New York at the venerable Watervliet arsenal, where the long-rifled barrels were forged and machined. These tubes, each over 20 feet and weighing nearly 20 tons, demanded precision boring equipment that few nations still possessed in the 1940s. Carriage assemblies came from Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, where steel frames were built to absorb the fury of recoil and allow controlled traverse and elevation. At every step, the process was a fusion of craftsmanship and mass production. Guns of this size had once taken years to construct in small numbers. The United States turned them out by the dozen, even while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of Shermans, aircraft, and smaller artillery pieces. The weapons' appetite was equally vast. Each 360-pound high-explosive shell had to be manufactured in specialized ammunition plants, packed with carefully measured charges of amatol or TNT, and then crated for transport. By war's end, tens of thousands of rounds were produced, every one of them a logistical challenge. A single battalion of 4 howitzers might expend dozens of shells in a single day of combat, meaning that entire freight trains had to be dedicated to supplying these guns. Depots in Britain and later in France stacked crates of ammunition like towers, guarded against damp and fire. The handling requirements were exacting. The shells were too heavy for men alone, requiring cranes, forklifts, and mechanical hoists at every stage. To move the guns themselves was a feat of engineering. Unlike smaller field pieces, the 240mm could not be dragged into place intact. Instead, it was disassembled into massive loads, one for the barrel, another for the carriage, each borne on an 8-wheeled transporter. Heavy tractors such as the M33 Prime Mover or the M25 Dragon Wagon pulled these convoys, engines straining as they climbed the ridges of Italy or churned through the mud of Normandy. Roads not built for such burdens cracked beneath their weight, forcing engineers to lay temporary surfaces of timber and steel. In some cases, entire platforms had to be constructed before a battery could fire. The ground spaded and reinforced to bear the recoil of repeated blasts. The scale of this effort might have made the weapon impractical for any other belligerent, but American industry and logistics could absorb the burden. The U.S. Army's system of transportation, with its web of depots, railways, and truck convoys, ensured that the howitzers arrived where they were needed. Germany, by contrast, struggled even to keep its existing heavy artillery supplied. Shortages of fuel and steel forced them to abandon or limit production of railway guns and large siege pieces. American officers noted with pride that where the Reich could maintain only a handful of 21 cm or 24 cm pieces on the front, the United States could deploy multiple 240mm battalions across 2 theaters simultaneously. To German observers, this was more than a technical achievement. It was a revelation of Allied superiority. Prisoners and captured reports alike remarked with astonishment at the smoothness with which these monsters appeared on the battlefield. Where German guns arrived in ones or twos, often after chaotic movements, the Americans produced their heavy battalions almost as if on schedule, supplied by a river of trucks and trains that never seemed to run dry. The message was unavoidable. However strong a fortress might be, the Allies could always escalate. That industrial might not only place the 240mm howitzer on the battlefield, but kept it firing, day after day until walls crumbled and resistance thinned. The stage was now set for its expanded role, as the weapon moved beyond Italy to the hedgerows of Normandy and the fortress cities of France, where its thunder would again prove decisive. June 1944 brought the monster from Italy's mountains to the northern coasts of France. When the US VII Corps closed in on Cherbourg, they faced German batteries embedded in casemates of reinforced concrete, positions so thick that even naval gunfire from battleships had left them intact. American infantry advanced cautiously, well aware that coastal guns overlooked every approach. Then on June 25th, the first 240mm howitzers emplaced behind the city began their work. The shells, 360 pounds apiece, arced over the ridges and slammed into the fortifications with a violence unmatched by anything the Germans had yet endured in Normandy. Survivors later reported that the concussions alone killed men deep inside bunkers, crushing lungs and rupturing eardrums. Others were buried alive when roofs pancaked under the weight of debris. When American infantry reached the batteries, they found them silent, some abandoned in panic, others reduced to collapsed ruins. Cherbourg, a port the Germans believed impregnable, fell within days, and the 240mm howitzer was written into its story as the weapon that broke the city's spine. By autumn, the Allied advance pressed against the Siegfried Line, Germany's western wall of pillboxes, dragon's teeth and concrete emplacements. Here again the 240mm proved indispensable. In September 1944, batteries methodically targeted strongpoints around Aachen, blasting apart defenses that anchored the line. Photographs taken afterward show the iconic dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles blasted into heaps, bunkers split open, and defensive belts torn into corridors wide enough for armored columns to push through. Infantry advancing behind the bombardment reported fewer machine gun nests firing, their embrasures sealed by direct hits or rockfalls triggered by concussions. German defenders, long assured that the Siegfried Line was unbreakable, now saw breaches widened under thunderous salvos. The 240mm gave weight to every assault, turning static barriers into rubble-strewn approaches. The fortress city of Metz offered perhaps the most dramatic demonstration. In November 1944, Patton's Third Army faced one of Europe's oldest strongholds, a city girdled by 19th-century forts modernized with reinforced bunkers and artillery positions. German commanders trusted that Metz's walls, strengthened by decades of military engineering, would stall the American advance for months. But Patton brought his heavy artillery in force, including the 240mm howitzers. Day after day, they poured shells into the forts, collapsing casemates and silencing guns that had once dominated approaches. Witnesses described walls centuries old folding inwards under the pressure of modern explosives. Even the deep caverns of Fort Jeanne d'Arc, once thought impregnable, shook as though an earthquake passed through its foundations. For the German garrison, the realization was sobering. If Metz could fall to artillery, then no fortress in Europe was beyond reach. Within weeks the city capitulated, its defenders worn down not only by assault, but by the unrelenting weight of bombardment. Each of these campaigns added to the weapon's reputation. Among American commanders, the 240mm became the trusted solution for obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Infantry, once wary of throwing themselves against bunkers, took courage knowing that the big guns would speak first. For German troops, the sound of its fire became synonymous with despair. Reports from interrogated prisoners spoke of men refusing to remain in concrete shelters once the heavy howitzers were suspected in range, choosing instead to scatter in open ground, where at least they felt they could breathe. The gun's thunder was not simply destructive. It was corrosive, eating away at confidence in engineering and doctrine alike. From Cherbourg to Aachen, from the Siegfried Line to Metz, the evidence became undeniable. Wherever the 240mm howitzer appeared, German defenses cracked, strongholds yielded, and the illusion of permanence in fortifications dissolved. Yet the physical destruction tells only part of the story. The deeper mark of the monster lay in the minds of those who faced it, the psychological toll of living under its shadow. That impact would become as decisive as the rubble it left behind. The true power of the 240mm howitzer was measured not only in concrete shattered or bunkers reduced to rubble, but in the weight it pressed upon the minds of those who lived beneath its shadow. German soldiers quickly learned to distinguish its voice from other artillery. Where the 105mm gave a rapid crack and the 155mm a long whistle before impact, the monster's approach was unmistakable. A slow-building scream, deep and metallic, that seemed to tear through the air itself. Men crouching in dugouts had seconds to realize the shell was coming for them, seconds to feel their throats tighten and their stomachs sink before the blast arrived with a deafening concussion that threw earth and dust in all directions. Survivors spoke of their ears ringing for hours, of pressure waves that left them dazed and staggering, of the uncanny sensation that the ground itself had risen up to strike them. Accounts from Cassino, Cherbourg and Metz all repeat the same theme: helplessness. One German paratrooper recalled being pinned inside a shelter as the ceiling collapsed, his comrades crushed before he could even move. Another wrote that after a salvo, he found himself crawling into daylight with blood on his face, and no memory of how he had escaped. The psychological damage went beyond the moment of impact. Men began to distrust the very defenses they had been told were unassailable. Whispered conversations spoke of bunker knacker, bunker busters, an admission that steel doors and concrete walls no longer offered salvation. Fatalism crept into the ranks. If the earthquake shells began to fall, there was little to do but hope one was not under them. German officers tried to hold the line with rational arguments. They reminded their men that the big guns fired slowly, that there were long pauses between rounds, that dispersal reduced casualties. Yet such logic could not erase the knowledge that a single hit could erase an entire section. Some units developed rituals of superstition, soldiers tapping helmets or reciting prayers at the first whistle. Others simply deserted their posts when they suspected the heavy howitzers were within range. Interrogation reports captured by the Allies revealed repeated mentions of no safe place, words that undermined the very foundation of German defensive doctrine. On the other side of the battlefield, the psychological effect was reversed. To Allied infantry, the deep reports of the 240mm guns became the sound of inevitability. Before an assault, men who had once dreaded throwing themselves against fortified positions felt confidence when they knew the heavy battalions were supporting them. A platoon sergeant at Cherbourg told his men that nothing those bastards build can stand against what we've got now, and the rubble-strewn bunkers they passed confirmed his claim. Morale soared when impregnable strongholds yielded to bombardment, when obstacles that had taken years to build were undone in minutes. The howitzers symbolized industrial certainty, proof that the Allies had the weight, the reach, and the will to break through anything. This dual impact, despair among defenders, assurance among attackers, magnified the gun's tactical value. It was not just a weapon but a message. Every shell announced that the war was tilting irreversibly toward the Allies, that resistance was not merely dangerous, but futile. German prisoners often cited the heavy artillery as one of the reasons they chose surrender over continued defense. Allied soldiers, meanwhile, carried forward the sense that they were backed by unchallengeable might. Thus the 240mm howitzer reshaped the emotional terrain of battle. Its destruction was visible in collapsed bunkers and breached fortresses, but its true legacy lay in the erosion of German will and the strengthening of Allied determination. It forced a mental shift as decisive as any tactical breach, the recognition that no wall was permanent, no fortress eternal. From this psychological battlefield, the story turns naturally toward the larger tactical and strategic consequences of wielding such a weapon across the campaigns. On the battlefield, the arrival of the 240mm howitzer altered the logic of attack and defense. Before its deployment, fortified lines and concrete emplacements promised to bleed attackers white, forcing infantry into costly assaults with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and close-quarters fighting. Once the big guns were in play, that equation shifted. American divisions advancing against bunkers could wait while the heavy artillery worked its will, systematically collapsing strongpoints, silencing machine gun nests, and opening gaps wide enough for tanks and infantry to pass with reduced risk. The effect was more than physical destruction. It was the transformation of tempo. Where once an advance might grind to a halt for weeks against a fortress or fortified line, the 240 mm allowed attacks to proceed in days. Nowhere was this more visible than at Metz. For centuries, the fortress had been considered impregnable, a keystone of German defensive thinking. In November 1944, Patton's Third Army faced the task of reducing its ring of forts. With the 240 mm howitzers emplaced, the problem became less one of storming walls than of smashing them flat. Strongpoints that had been designed to absorb prolonged sieges cracked in days. The collapse of Metz not only freed Third Army to advance, but also sent a message across the Western Front. Even the strongest fortresses would not delay the Allies indefinitely. Strategically, this meant momentum could be maintained. Campaigns kept on schedule, and supplies kept flowing forward rather than bogging down in drawn-out sieges. The Siegfried Line, too, revealed the tactical utility of the weapon. In September 1944, as Allied armies pushed toward Aachen, they confronted the concrete dragon's teeth, pillboxes, and interlocking fields of fire that had been meant to anchor German defenses. Without the 240 mm, progress might have slowed into attritional assaults. With it, artillery could punch corridors through the line. Each breach not only allowed armored divisions to penetrate, but also forced the Germans to stretch thin their reserves, attempting to cover gaps that widened with every salvo. This denied the Wehrmacht the chance to stabilize the front, robbing them of the time they had counted on to regroup. By early 1945, the same story repeated in the Ruhr. German commanders, recognizing that fixed defenses no longer provided the insurance they once had, shifted their doctrine. Reports noted more frequent withdrawals and a greater reliance on maneuver, not because it suited their preference, but because static positions had become death traps. Once the Americans brought in their siege artillery, no bunker, no line, no fortress could be relied upon to stand. German troops increasingly spoke of their defenses as temporary shelters, useful only until the earthquake shells arrived. In this sense, the 240 mm howitzer helped unhinge the very philosophy of German defensive warfare. For the Allies, the effect was equally strategic. The ability to break lines systematically allowed them to keep pressure on the German army without pause. Every day gained meant fewer chances for the Wehrmacht to reorganize or for Hitler to shift divisions from other theaters. The heavy guns became tools not only of destruction, but of acceleration, allowing campaigns to advance in weeks rather than months. Commanders such as Bradley and Patton knew the value of time as well as ground, and the howitzers delivered both. Yet in all of this lay a sobering realization. The 240 mm howitzer had forced a revolution in doctrine, but at immense cost in transport, manpower, and industrial effort. It was a weapon that showed the Allies could bring overwhelming force to bear wherever needed, ensuring that no fortress or line could stall their advance for long. In the last year of the war, it played a decisive role in ensuring that momentum never shifted back to Germany. From here, the narrative naturally turns to the other side of the story, the limitations, drawbacks, and challenges that inevitably came with wielding such immense power. For all its thunder and awe, the 240 mm howitzer was not a flawless weapon. Its sheer size, the very feature that gave it unrivaled power, also created vulnerabilities that commanders could never entirely overcome. Moving the gun was a campaign in itself. Each piece had to be disassembled into two immense loads, barrel and carriage, before being hauled by heavy tractors across roads often never meant to bear such weight. Mud, snow, or even narrow village streets could stall the process for hours. During these convoys, the guns were conspicuous targets. Aerial reconnaissance quickly spotted the telltale lines of heavy prime movers, and Luftwaffe pilots knew that a column immobilized by bombs or strafing could be rendered useless long before it fired a shot. Even once a firing site was chosen, the difficulties multiplied. Emplacement required hours of labor, clearing and leveling ground, laying platforms or timber mats in wet weather, and anchoring the trails to absorb recoil. Unlike smaller howitzers that could unlimber and fire within minutes, the 240 mm demanded careful preparation. Every moment spent in setup exposed the crews to the risk of counter-battery fire. German artillery units were quick to listen for the slow, thunderous voice of the monster, plotting its arc and attempting to return fire before the Americans shifted position. Then there was the rate of fire. Their well-drilled crew, aided by cranes and loading trays, could manage perhaps one round every 4 or 5 minutes. In the heat of an offensive, this felt agonizingly slow compared to the steady rhythms of 105 mm batteries, which could pour shells onto a target in sustained barrages. The 240 mm could not saturate. It could only strike with precision and overwhelming effect. That meant commanders had to use it selectively, reserving its thunder for hardened targets that justified the immense effort. Routine fire missions were left to lighter pieces. Ammunition supply compounded the problem. Each shell weighed 360 pounds, and a single battery might consume dozens in a day's firing. Transporting them required dedicated rail cars, truck convoys, and storage depots. An extended bombardment strained logistical networks already carrying fuel, rations, and ammunition for hundreds of thousands of men. Artillery officers had to balance ambition with reality. Every shell fired by a 240 mm howitzer represented a substantial cost in space, fuel, and manpower. Sustained bombardments could empty local dumps within days, forcing resupply from depots hundreds of miles to the rear. Weather made matters worse. In Italy's winter rains or the sodden fields of northern France, heavy guns bogged down easily. Platforms had to be reinforced, and in some cases engineers built entire roads to drag the guns into position. Crews recalled spending longer laying foundations than firing missions. Without careful preparation, a 240 might sink into the mud after only a few salvos, its accuracy ruined and its mobility gone. Yet adaptations emerged. By late 1944, improved prime movers such as the M33E's transport, while refined crane systems sped assembly. Firing doctrines evolved. Rather than prolonged barrages, commanders ordered concentrated salvos against the most critical targets, maximizing psychological and physical effect with fewer rounds. Coordination with air reconnaissance allowed batteries to strike key bunkers precisely, saving ammunition and time. The Americans learned that these giants were best used as scalpels of destruction, not hammers of saturation. The Germans too adapted. Once they recognized the caliber in play, they dispersed their defenses more widely, camouflaged positions, and relied less on static bunkers. Mobility, concealment, and deception became their countermeasures, though even then no adaptation offered complete safety. When the monster fired, it still inspired dread, no matter how spread out or hidden the defenders tried to be. In this balance of power and weakness lay the true character of the 240 mm howitzer. It was not a perfect weapon, too slow, too heavy, too costly for indiscriminate use, but when called upon it remained decisive, a weapon that altered the course of battles even within the limits of its design. From these contradictions emerged its legacy, a symbol of both the possibilities and the challenges of modern siege artillery, a weapon whose echoes would be felt not only in the closing months of the war, but in the doctrines and arsenals that... By the closing months of 1945, the 240 mm howitzer had secured its reputation as the heaviest field artillery piece the United States ever committed to combat. In Europe, it had shattered bunkers, fortresses, and defensive lines, once thought impregnable. Now, as the war shifted toward its final phase in the Pacific, the giant guns were shipped across oceans once more. On Okinawa, their thunder rolled over ridges and cave complexes, where Japanese defenders clung tenaciously to ground, confident that aerial bombardment alone could not root them out. The howitzers proved otherwise. Their shells tore into limestone cliffs and collapsed tunnel networks, smothering defenders in rockfalls. By the time preparations began for Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of the Japanese home islands, 240 mm battalions were earmarked for the first wave of assaults, intended to reduce beach fortifications and underground command centers before infantry ever landed. Though the atomic bomb made that invasion unnecessary, the mere fact that such weapons had been readied underscores the place they held in Allied strategy, the ultimate answer to entrenched resistance. Peace did not consign them to rust. Within 5 years, the Korean War demanded their return. There on ridgelines and against deeply dug-in North Korean and Chinese positions, the 240mm again proved its worth. Reports from 1951 describe how batteries supporting UN forces reduced enemy caves and bunkers that had resisted every lesser caliber. Just as in Europe, their rate of fire was slow and their mobility cumbersome. But when a position had to be obliterated, nothing else sufficed. For many American infantrymen trudging up steep Korean slopes, the thunder of the big guns was both a reassurance and a reminder of the industrial weight they carried with them into battle. The weapon also left its mark on doctrine. In the early Cold War, with both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, envisioning a Europe laced with fortified command centers and hardened missile sites, the 240mm lessons lingered. Military planners acknowledged the need for super-heavy artillery, capable of smashing underground complexes. The American T-92 240mm gun, and later experimental heavy howitzers, carried forward that lineage. Even the Soviets, who had fielded their own massive 203mm and 210mm pieces during the Second World War, studied the American weapons' performance as they developed their post-war arsenal. The 240mm had shown that there was still a place for giant artillery in a world not yet fully given over to the missile. And yet, by the late 1950s and 1960s, the age of such giants was drawing to a close. Advances in guided missiles, tactical nuclear weapons, and precision bombing gradually eclipsed the role of super-heavy field artillery. The logistical burden of transporting, supplying, and protecting weapons like the 240mm no longer seemed justified in an era when a single missile could strike deeper and faster. Many of the howitzers were retired, some preserved in museums or placed on display outside American bases, silent reminders of an era when steel and explosive power alone dictated the rhythm of campaigns. But for the men who had faced it, in Cassino's rubble, in the bunkers of Cherbourg, in the shattered forts of Metz, the memory never faded. German veterans would later recall the helplessness of hearing its shells arrive, the certainty that no wall could save them. For the Americans who served it, the howitzer embodied the arsenal of democracy's promise. That industry and will combined could overcome any defense. Its legacy is thus double-edged, both a relic of a fading age of giants and a symbol of Allied determination at the moment when victory was most uncertain. And so the story closes in the echo of its first great shock. German soldiers crouched in bunkers along the Atlantic Wall or the slopes of Cassino, confident in their concrete, suddenly feeling the earth shudder as though the sky itself had broken. That moment of disbelief and dread was the true legacy of the 240mm howitzer, a weapon that turned stone to dust, silence to thunder, and resistance into surrender. The story closes where it first opened, in the bunkers of Europe, where men once believed that walls of steel and concrete could outlast the storm. For the German defenders, faith in fortification was more than doctrine. It was survival. The Siegfried Line, the Atlantic Wall, the mountain bastions of Italy, each promised sanctuary, a chance to endure until relief or counterattack arrived. Yet when the 240mm howitzers spoke, that promise dissolved in thunder. Ceilings buckled, embrasures caved in, and those who staggered out alive carried in their eyes the recognition that nothing was safe. Nothing was permanent. For the Allies, the weapon meant something very different. Each shell that collapsed a bunker was a promise kept, that no fortress could stall them indefinitely. That momentum would not falter, that the immense weight of American industry could grind through even the toughest defenses. To infantry slogging forward through minefields and wire, the heavy howitzers were not just tools of destruction, but symbols of inevitability. Behind their thunder lay reassurance, the certainty that what men could build, other men with the right machines could unbuild. In those moments of collapse, the war revealed its deeper character. The Second World War was not only a contest of courage, endurance, or tactical brilliance, it was a confrontation decided by firepower, by industry, and by the capacity to project overwhelming force at the point of greatest resistance. The 240mm howitzer embodied that reality, showing that the very foundation of German strategy, fortified lines and impregnable strongholds, could be undone in days. The echoes of those bombardments lingered far beyond the craters they left. In the stunned expressions of German survivors, one glimpses the psychological truth of the war, that belief in defense gave way to resignation, while belief in victory surged among those who marched behind the guns. From Cassino's shattered stones to the broken forts of Metz, from the breached Siegfried Line to the silent bunkers of Cherbourg, the monster left its mark not only in rubble but in memory. Today, the hulking carcasses of a few preserved howitzers stand mute in museums and memorials, their barrels pointing skyward as though still seeking a target. Yet their true legacy lies in the lesson they taught, that in an age of total war, nothing was truly impregnable. The thunder they unleashed became the voice of victory, and in the silence that followed, only echoes remained, echoes of bunkers collapsing, of fear dissolving into surrender, of an empire's confidence shattered by steel and fire.